On January 31st, 2026, viewers across America woke up to a story that cuts to the heart of what it means to live in a free society. The image of veteran journalist Don Lemon, hands folded, jaw set, standing outside a federal courthouse and declaring to cameras, "I will not be silent." Confirming what many had heard only in fragments the night before, he laid out in plain terms that federal agents from the Trump Justice Department had come for him in the dead of night, arrested him, and brought him into court not for some secretive scheme or hidden crime, but for what he insists he has been doing openly for 3 decades, covering the news as a journalist, this time at an anti-ICE protest inside a church in St. Paul, Minnesota on January 18th, 2026. This is not a rumor, not an internet whisper, but a confirmed, unfolding federal case now on the record. Don Lemon has been indicted by a Minnesota grand jury on federal civil rights charges tied to his reporting inside City's church, where protesters disrupted a worship service to denounce immigration and customs enforcement, saying one of the pastors was a high-ranking ICE official in the St. Paul field office. If you are watching this today, you are witnessing in real time a moment that journalists, civil rights advocates, and everyday citizens will be talking about for years to come, a direct collision between the power of the federal government and the protections of the First Amendment, with a well-known journalist at the center of the storm. Viewers should be clear on what has been confirmed so far. Don Lemon, age 59, former CNN anchor turned independent journalist and YouTube broadcaster, traveled to St. Paul earlier this month to cover a protest that moved from the streets into the sanctuary of City's church. He live-streamed from inside the church as demonstrators chanted "ICE out" and "Justice for Renee Good," accusing one of the pastors, who serves as acting field director for ICE in the area, of being complicit in harsh immigration enforcement. Days later, after a magistrate judge initially refused to allow federal officials to arrest Lemon, the Department of Justice, led by Attorney General Pam Bondi, took the case to a grand jury, which returned a felony indictment against him and 8 others, including Minnesota journalist Georgia Fort. Federal agents then arrested Lemon on Thursday night in Los Angeles, where he was preparing to cover the Grammy Awards, and arrested Fort and 2 other local defendants in Minnesota in early morning raids. The U.S. Attorney General publicly confirmed these arrests in a social media post, pointedly saying they were carried out at my direction and describing the protest as a coordinated attack on City's church in St. Paul, Minnesota. At the same time, the White House amplified the political backdrop with a social media post jabbing at Lemon when life gives you lemons, paired with a chain emoji, sending an unmistakable signal of satisfaction from a president who has feuded with the journalist for years. For viewers trying to make sense of this moment, the stakes are stark. A sitting administration is celebrating the arrest of one of its most vocal media critics, while its Justice Department deploys federal civil rights laws not to defend journalists, but against them. The headline tonight is straightforward but extraordinary. Don Lemon, a former CNN anchor and now an independent journalist, has been charged by a federal grand jury in Minnesota with conspiracy and with interfering with the rights of worshipers during a January 18th, 2026 protest at City's church in St. Paul, and he insists these charges criminalize standard news gathering. Prosecutors allege that Lemon and 8 co-defendants oppressed, threatened, and intimidated congregants and pastors by occupying the main aisle and rows of chairs near the front of the sanctuary, surrounding the pastor and physically obstructing some congregants as they tried to leave, forcing the early termination of the worship service and leaving children wondering whether their parents were going to die. The Justice Department has invoked statutes designed to protect the free exercise of religion, arguing that the protest and Lemon's actions within it cross the line from coverage into active interference with worship. Lemon and fellow journalist Georgia Fort vehemently reject that characterization, stating that they were present strictly as members of the press, documenting what unfolded and publishing footage that, in their telling, speaks for itself. Their attorneys described the case as an unprecedented assault on the First Amendment and a transparent attempt to divert public attention from the administration's political troubles and from mounting criticism of its immigration enforcement tactics. For anyone watching this broadcast, the core conflict can be summarized in one line. Prosecutors say this was a coordinated takeover of a church. The journalists say this was constitutionally protected coverage of a protest with cameras rolling. To truly understand how we arrived at this confrontation, it's important to walk through the events in order. On January 18, 2026, anti-ICE activists entered City's Church in St. Paul during a Sunday worship service, targeting a pastor whom they identified as the acting field director for immigration and customs enforcement in the region. Protesters marched down the main aisle, occupied rows of chairs near the front, and began chanting slogans like "ICE out" and "Justice for Renee Good," referencing a specific case that had become a rallying cry for local immigration activists. Don Lemon, who had been covering increasingly confrontational clashes over immigration enforcement as part of his independent journalism work on YouTube, went into the church alongside the protesters, recording video, narrating events, and interviewing people in the room. In his live stream, he can be heard clearly explaining to viewers and to church staff that he is not an activist, but a journalist, there to photograph, chronicle, and report on what is happening. I'm just here photographing. I'm not part of the group. I'm a journalist. We're here just chronicling and reporting. We're not part of the activists, but we're here just reporting on them. Similar footage exists of Minnesota-based journalist Georgia Fort, who also live-streamed portions of the event and later shared video of her own arrest when agents arrived at her home, an arrest she directly linked to her decision to film and publish coverage of the church protest. In the days immediately following the protest, the Trump administration's Justice Department signaled its intent to treat the church disruption as a federal civil rights case. The government initially sought to charge 8 individuals, including Lemon, under statutes that criminalize conspiracy to infringe on civil rights and interference with the right to worship freely at a religious institution. However, when prosecutors first presented their case to a magistrate judge, that judge declined to approve arrest warrants for all of the proposed defendants, reportedly expressing skepticism about some aspects of the evidence and excluding Lehman from the initial set of those facing charges. Rather than backing down, the Justice Department escalated. An appeals court reportedly suggested that prosecutors take their case to a federal grand jury to determine whether charges were warranted. The government did exactly that, and the grand jury ultimately returned an indictment that not only included local activists, but also restored Don Lemon and journalist Georgia Fort to the list of defendants. With the indictment in hand, federal agents moved swiftly. On the night of Thursday, January 29th, Lemon was in Los Angeles preparing to cover the upcoming Grammy Awards as part of his independent media work when federal agents arrested him and took him into custody on federal civil rights charges. Almost simultaneously in Minnesota, Fort and 2 others, identified in public statements as activists Traherne Jean Cruz and Jamiel Lydell Lundy, were arrested by teams of agents from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. Fort later described how roughly 24 agents surrounded her home while her 3 young daughters were inside, prompting her to start recording on her phone, telling viewers, "Agents are at my door right now. This is all stemming from the fact that I filmed a protest as a member of the media." She spoke of the fear in her children's eyes and of her own shock at being placed in handcuffs for doing what she believed was routine journalistic work. By Friday, January 30th, Lemon had appeared in federal court and was released without bond, while a judge in Minnesota also ordered the release of Lemon and Fort pending trial, underscoring that neither was considered a flight risk or a danger to the community. After walking out of court in Los Angeles, Lemon spoke briefly but forcefully to a crowd of supporters and journalists. He recounted how last night, the DOJ sent a team of federal agents to arrest me in the middle of the night for something that I've been doing for the last 30 years, and that is covering the news, stressing that the First Amendment of the Constitution protects this work, not only for him, but for countless journalists across the country. He declared that he stands with all of them and vowed, "I will not be silent," adding that he looks forward to his day in court, framing the case as a test not just of his own liberty, but of press freedom more broadly. At the heart of the indictment are vivid and sharply contested allegations. Prosecutors contend that Lemon and his co-defendants executed a coordinated takeover-style attack on City's church, claiming they oppressed, threatened, and intimidated congregants and pastors. The indictment describes the defendants physically occupying most of the main aisle and front rows, surrounding the pastor in what is portrayed as an attempt to oppress and intimidate him, and ignoring multiple requests to leave the sanctuary. It alleges that as the disruption escalated, congregants fled in fear for their safety, that church leaders activated an emergency plan, and that children inside the church experienced terror to the point that one child later asked whether their parents were going to die. Officials argue that this conduct directly violated federal laws protecting the right of religious communities to worship without interference, and that anyone, journalist or not, who crosses that line can be held criminally responsible. Lemon and Fort, however, insist that these characterizations distort the reality on the ground. They argue that from beginning to end, they acted solely in their capacity as journalists, entering the church not as organizers or participants in the protest, but as observers documenting a matter of obvious public interest, activists choosing to confront a senior immigration enforcement official in his own church over federal policy. Fort, speaking with Anderson Cooper after her release, emphasized that her published footage speaks for itself and that her role was to document, not to direct or lead. She underscored that she has spent nearly 2 decades in media, with 14 regional Emmy nominations and 3 Emmy wins for independent television work in the Midwest, and that as a Minnesota native, she covers her own community rather than parachuting in and out. As an American-born citizen, she said, she had always believed that the First Amendment's protection of a free press applied to her work, but her arrest, accompanied by a large law enforcement presence at her family home, left her questioning whether those constitutional promises are now a thing of the past or simply empty promises. Lemon's attorney, Abby Lowell, and Fort's legal team have framed the case in sweeping constitutional terms. In a public statement, Lowell called the prosecution an unprecedented attack on the First Amendment and a transparent attempt to distract attention from the many crises facing this administration, vowing that Lemon will fight the charges vigorously and thoroughly in court. Defense attorneys argue that applying religious freedom statutes to journalists who are present to report on protests risks turning almost any coverage of contentious demonstrations at religious sites into a potential crime. A precedent, they say, would chill coverage of everything from civil rights sit-ins to peaceful vigils that draw media attention. Media advocacy groups and civil liberties organizations have begun to echo those concerns, warning that if prosecutors are allowed to treat cameras and microphones inside a protest as tools of a criminal coordinated attack, then any journalist who documents a disruptive, nonviolent act of civil disobedience could find themselves in handcuffs. Georgia Fort spoke movingly about the human cost of that prospect. She described how, as journalists, we never want to be the story. Yet she felt compelled to record and share her own arrest so that the public could see that journalism is on trial, and that simply documenting what is happening in communities may now carry the risk of being criminalized. She said that what is happening in Minnesota should be quite alarming to the entire nation, and urged mainstream media, not just independent outlets, to recognize the danger in allowing the criminalization of reporting to go unchallenged. Fort, a mother of 3 daughters, explained that her immediate focus is on helping her children recover from the trauma of watching their home surrounded and their mother taken away, as well as on her own emotional recovery. But beyond that, she is relying on her experienced legal team, widely respected among media law experts, to fight the charges while she presses forward with her commitment to tell the stories of her community, insisting she will continue to tell the stories of my community despite the intimidation. The response from Attorney General Pam Bondi underscores how differently the government views the same set of events. In a video message posted on social media, Bondi warned that there must be no doubt that under President Donald Trump and this administration, Americans have the right to practice their faith freely and safely, and that if anyone breaches that sacred right, we will pursue you. She reiterated that Lemon, Fort, and 2 other defendants were arrested at my direction in connection with what she again called a coordinated attack on City's church, sending a pointed message that the highest levels of the Justice Department are personally invested in this prosecution. Lead pastor Jonathan Parnell of City's Church publicly thanked the DOJ for acting swiftly to protect his congregation, stating that such action was necessary to ensure the church could continue to live out its mission without fear of disruption. For supporters of the administration and many churchgoers nationwide, this case is framed as a firm stand against the intimidation of religious communities in their most sacred spaces. This clash of perspectives between those who see a sledgehammer brought down on the First Amendment and those who see a long overdue defense of religious worship recalls earlier chapters in American history where journalism, protest, and government power collided. Legal scholars point to landmark cases like the Pentagon Papers, where the Supreme Court refused to allow the government to block publication of classified documents exposing the Vietnam War's realities, and to periods when civil rights reporters faced arrests and violence simply for covering marches and sit-ins outside segregated churches and lunch counters. During the Obama administration, there was strong criticism of leak investigations that swept up reporters' phone records, but those cases largely centered on classified national security information, not on the basic act of covering a public protest. Under Donald Trump's earlier tenure, the rhetoric escalated dramatically. Journalists were labeled enemies of the people, and news organizations were targeted as purveyors of fake news. Yet criminal charges against reporters for standard news gathering at protests remained relatively rare. With this case, many observers argue the Trump administration has crossed a new threshold by using civil rights protections for religious worshipers as a legal weapon against journalists who say they were simply doing their jobs. For viewers absorbing all of this, the implications extend far beyond Don Lemon as an individual figure. If the government is successful in convincing a jury that Lemon's presence with a camera in the main aisle of a church during a protest, his proximity to the pastor, and his movements near an exit amounted to criminal oppression and obstruction of worship, then any journalist embedded within a protest that spills into sensitive spaces, from sanctuaries to government buildings, could be vulnerable to similar charges. On the other hand, if the courts reaffirm that journalists retain robust protections when they document even disruptive acts of civil disobedience, this case could strengthen press freedom and set clearer boundaries on the government's use of civil rights statutes. As Don Lemon himself put it in a YouTube broadcast after his release, this moment is a call for journalists to support one another, warning that if the government succeeds in suppressing journalists now, others could be next. Tonight, as you watch, what is undeniable is that we have entered a new and uncertain chapter in the relationship between the press and political power in the United States. The timeline is clear. A protest at a Minnesota church on January 18th, a rejected arrest bid before a magistrate, a grand jury indictment, middle-of-the-night raids by federal agents, and now the spectacle of a nationally known journalist and a widely respected local reporter standing accused of federal civil rights crimes for what they insist was routine reporting. The voices are clear as well. Don Lemon saying he will not be silent and looks forward to his day in court. Georgia Fort warning that journalism itself is on trial and vowing to keep telling her community's stories. Pam Bondi promising to pursue anyone who breaches what she calls a sacred right to worship. And a president whose public mockery of a journalist's arrest underscores just how political this moment has become. As this story continues to unfold, viewers can expect a series of legal hearings in Minnesota, motions challenging the indictment, and intense scrutiny from media lawyers, civil rights advocates, and religious liberty groups alike. There will be questions about how close journalists can get to protesters without being deemed participants, about where the line lies between documenting disruption and aiding it, and about whether news gathering in sensitive spaces like churches can ever again be conducted without fear of criminal liability. For now, the facts are stark. Don Lemon and Georgia Ford are out of jail but facing serious federal charges. The Trump Justice Department is unapologetic and emphatic that it is defending religious freedom. And the nation is watching as a case that began with a protest inside a St. Paul church becomes a defining test of press freedom in 21st century America.